Cities After is a bi-monthly podcast about the future of cities. Grounded in our daily urban struggles, it is part dystopian and part utopian. My intention is to entice your civic imagination into action, because we know that a more just and sustainable urban future is possible. This is Miguel Robles-Durán, and I dare you to imagine our cities after.
COVID, global warming, gentrification,
exploitation,
homelessness,
racism,
colonialism,
patriarchy,
hunger,
police brutality,
private property,
Capitalism. This podcast is made possible by Democracy at Work.
This episode was recorded with a live audience at the New School in New York City.
Good evening. Our guest tonight is one of the most influential feminist thinkers of our times, a full-time activist, scholar, and a teacher that since the 1960s has been radicalizing left-thinking traditions to their core. And this is by posing critical questions about the role of women's reproductive labor in the development of human environment and social conditions under capitalism. Please welcome Silvia Federici. Now I'm gonna start with a little song, Silvia. Let me see if we remember this. Una mattina mi sono alzato, right? Oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, 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 right? So Silvia, this song for sure reminds you of your time in Italy growing up in Parma, right?
Yeah.
A communist city,
Yeah.
post-war,
Mm-hmm.
and as you sometimes say, seemingly post-fascist. Yes.
Similarly post-fascist, yes.
So we're talking a very specific Italy at the time. So I wonder, I'm curious to know what was the city and the social environment at that time. I mean, that you were growing up, and most importantly, what was driving you to sing along? Ciao Bella.
Well, first of all, I'm very pleased to be here with all of you. And the topic is really very, very powerful, because we are, I think, globally, in the midst of a whole process of social transformation of the city as a very, very contested territory, as we know all too well here in New York. And so going back and rethinking, other experiences is very important for me too. I had the fortune of growing up in a town, Parma, who was very politicized, had been very politicized long before I was born. In 1922, in August of 1922, Parma was one of the sites of a famous anti-fascist resistance that is still commemorated to this day. For 3 days, working class people in the working class neighborhood fought in the street, erecting barricades against fascists, against the force of above almost 10,000 fascists who were trying to come to break a strike. So, and that tradition continued. During the war, in the hills around the town, there were partisan groups, sustained by the work that people in the town did. There was a constant communication. So, and from the 50s to the 70s, it was a communist town. So the culture that was breathing in the town was very political. I remember May Day, thousands of people in the street, 8 in the morning, the cars going around with Bella Ciao, the talks about the war, the struggle against fascism, the future is going to come, and everybody wearing red carnation. But I also became used to a very politicized urban space. Everybody knew what were the places where you didn't go, because that was the bar and the street of the fascists. Fascism was made illegal after the end of the war. But in reality, everybody knew fascists were still around. And they were always trying to blow up the monument that had been erected to the partisan. We have this beautiful monument of the partisan very romantic. And as far as I remember, almost every year, the fascists in town were trying to blow it up. So the town was the space itself was very political. You don't go to this bar. This is the bar of the fascists. You don't go down this alley. This is the place where you can get beaten up. So there was a very clear political configuration. But there were also other spaces that were very important. For example, the market. The market was the most proletarian place, and it was a place of gathering. Once a week, people came from all the surrounding villages, from the rural areas. You could hear the dialect. It's a beautiful, powerful dialect. So the market was a real proletarian experience. And I think that that experience had an influence on me as well. From the time I was 15, 16, in my school, people were talking politics.
So I'm going to ask you a lot about contrast, right? I mean, and you're talking very specifically about Parma being a communist town. Was the rest of Italy connected to a certain extent to Parma, or did you felt somehow in a certain isolation within Parma being a communist town?
Well, at the time, as a young woman, it was very difficult for me. We didn't have much contact with the outside world. But no, looking at that history now, absolutely, there were a few towns and a few regions. Toscana, Umbria, Emilia. They were the three red regions of Italy. Most of Italy in the post-war period was under really a very, very heavy repression. The end of the war did not bring liberation in Italy. On the contrary, it brought an amazing wave of repression. There'll be the police in the factory, particularly at Fiat, and there'll be many massacres. In the 50s, many, and into the 60s, massacre of rural people, peasants trying to reclaim land. People didn't just fight against fascism. People fought against also capitalism. They fought for a better life. They fought for a very different kind of economic system. And so at the end of the war, there were, particularly in the South, big peasant movements who were trying to reclaim land, because in the South in particular you had a lot of latifund. And they were repressed with bloodbath. But also in the North, we had several massacres of workers when they went on strike. One famous in 1950, 6 workers were killed in a town near Parma, Modena. And, so it was a very, very repressive time. So it was a time also in which the church, the new Christian democratic government that was in power, used the church for the big anti-communist crusade.
So I assume that by that, of course, there was the feeling of a lot of repression, but getting a lot in what has been the subject of all your theories, being as a young woman in that condition, did you find something specific, that you were not able to articulate at that time? Or what was the context of being a young woman in a communist town, but surrounded by all of these massacres and all of this repression?
Yeah, there too, in a way, it was a fortunate fact of being in a more communist town, because the fascist culture that was ferociously anti-woman, ferociously misogynist, and was tempered in a place like Parma. And there was also all this legendary example of women who had joined the partisan, and all women in the town that have been working, organizing in support of the partisan commandos that were in the hills. And so that had an effect that it was a much more different culture also in relation to women, without idealizing and without, arguing that, of course, there was no machismo among the communists, far from it. But certainly it was a different climate from the kind of climate you found in other places, where, for example, the church or the Christian Democratic Party was far more dominant. in a general context, of Italy who had been, where the fascist culture had placed very deep roots, and certainly, shaped a lot of, misogynist attitude towards women.
Yeah, absolutely, and you can see that being reproduced also all over Europe.
Yes.
What was going on there. But I wonder, so that you're already teenage participating in a lot of these things, and something happens that you take a decision of moving to the U.S., Buffalo, right? What prompted you to this? I mean, considering that you were already participating in a lot of
well, I was not politically involved. I was not involved in any organizational work. I was identifying myself with the left, with revolution, and in fact, we were the young women and men of my generation in my school when I was going to high school. We were mostly critical of the Communist Party because to us was very bourgeois.
Yes.
So, if anything, I think I was a sort of a Maoist in my early youth.
Yes, and then for that reason,
But I was not politically involved. And the reason to come to the United States, it was fortuitous. I wanted to see the world. And so
and then you came to
I
Buffalo.
wanted to see the world, and my work prospects were pretty bad when I graduated.
Yeah.
After I graduated, my prospect was probably to teach, up in the mountain. You had a whole ether, First you started teaching in some village in the mountain, then gradually you came down to the cities. So I didn't want to close myself to begin to work in such a limited environment. I just wanted to see the world, so I started a plan. And this was the first place where I found a response. So it was very fortuitous.
But it was by no means an incredible moment for also a discovery for you, right?
Oh, it was.
You got involved with immediately with social movements,
absolutely,
right?
Absolutely, I was. I came to the States in August 1967.
Yes.
And this was a time, 67 in the United States was a really amazing level of turmoil. I was in Buffalo, and where I arrived, shortly after there had been riots in the black community, and a lot of protest was still there when I arrived towards the end of August, because the FBI had arrested a very prominent activist and intellectual in the black community, Martin Sostre, who then became the subject of many, many protests for years. He had been framed. Mm-hmm. In fact, there's a documentary that was made a few years ago, that explains what happened and how the FBI framed him. This was a man who had opened up a bookstore, a radical bookstore in the middle of the community, and with all kinds of books, and where people could go, could sit, could read. He was loved. And during the riot, he was there all the time. The bookstore was open, nothing was touched, people went in and out. This is why it was so dangerous. And so they pretended that he was selling drugs, and they found somebody who framed him. And so I arrived at, the campus was very, very much in turmoil. Then there were the Buffalo Nine. The Buffalo Nine were draft resistors. Buffalo is at the border with Canada, so many people who wanted to resist the draft would come to Buffalo to cross over the border. And these had been caught, they were jailed. And so immediately I arrived, and I was immediately drawn in.
Yeah, it must have been quite a contrast, right? You come from a very dense, sort of Italian community structure, then suddenly you're in this very strange suburban, not suburban town.
And to speak about the city, that in a sense was one of the most powerful experiences, because after I arrived, I started looking for the city. So I started asking people, where is the city? He said, what do you mean, where is the city? I said, but where is the city? So he said, but what do you mean? Oh, so then people said, okay, go the shopping center. They sent me to the shopping center. But this is not the city. And on Saturday, when I went, all other, it was lively, but then everything was shut down. Then said, oh no, go to the museum. And then in the end, after 2 months of looking for the city every weekend, I discovered there was no city. No city in my mind. What I conceive as the city, a place with a square, a kind of common, with a cafe where everybody meets, where you say hello, hello, hello to all the people, where you say, I'm just going into town because you want to see what's happening. I always grew up in situations where you going out was going to get in touch with the community, because you will know, you go to the cafe, you meet people, and there are places of gathering where the news are circulated. It's not like that anymore.
No, not
the
at all.
The spaces are like that, but the circulation is not there.
But at that time, also in Buffalo, I assume it was not there. I mean, what was the communal spaces?
Buffalo was a very classic, actually, compared to most American cities, actually Buffalo is better than many other American cities. But you see, the American cities have been built in a way that makes it impossible for people to really carry on. There's the place where you sleep, and the place where you work, and they're very separated. There's been a lot of thinking about, how to disaggregate people, how to make sure that after you work, you leave. Your reproduction is not taking place with the same people in the same space, where you're working, because that's very dangerous. So the science that has produced Levittown in suburbia, right? Distancing people, the car, these are all political. American towns are really the product of a very,
as a matter of fact, McCarthy was very much engaged in promoting this.
Exactly,
this
and of course the question of home ownership, exactly.
Yeah.
So I was not absolutely used to that, and the other thing also that was so incredible for me, I realized in coming to Buffalo, the power of memory and the power of architecture. I grew up, Parma is a medieval town. Actually, it's pre-medieval. The Etruscans were there. Even before the Etruscans, there were people building houses on stilts. Then came the Etruscan, then came the Roman. Then there was the Middle Ages, so there's a lot of history. And when you go around, I never thought of it. I mean, you take it for granted. But then when I was in Buffalo or in other American cities, I began to have a sense of disorientation, because I realized that those monuments, those streets, those do have an impact. You feel part of something of a history in which you locate yourself. And I realized that in the United States that history is there, but a lot has been done to destroy.
But
and they continue to do. There's a lot of work that is being done to, in fact, make sure that those spaces that are important for the creation of a collective memory, a memory of resistance, are being torn down.
As a matter of fact, I think at that time you were also creating, together with other people, of course, history in many ways. And there's something that also you became very aware. I mean, while you were confronting with more, let's say, hardcore left thinking and processes, it's that you began to discover what was going on in Italy, right? While you were in Buffalo, with Mario Tronti, with Operaismo, with a lot of the sort of the certain Marxist lines that were very present in Italy. And I understand that they had a very strong influence on you, right, at that time.
Yeah. Well, what happened is that, the blessing of having been raised in a communist town also had drawbacks because Parma had a very classic, traditional communist working class, and the Communist Party, as particularly as the years moved to the 60s, was increasingly subjected to a lot of criticism, but that never percolated in a town like Parma, where they had so much control, and so that kind of the new movements, who were also movement critical of the Communist Party, were taking place in other areas, the big industrial areas, Milano, Torino, Genova, right? Actually, something began to break in Italy's political economy, and particularly break with the repression that took place in Torino in 1962. In 1962, there was 3 famous days in Piazza Statuto. Is a square where basically what happened is that workers were calling for the strike, and one of the unions, which was a more right-wing union, didn't want to participate. And there was a protest that took place in this square, and it developed into 3 days of urban warfare. That was a turning point, I think, in Italian radical politics. We in Parma didn't hear anything about it.
Oh, wow.
We were, or at least maybe somebody older than me and more politically involved. But in places like Torino, Milano, it basically instigated, a whole new movement, intellectual and organizational as well. They took the name of operaismo, right? And the important intellectual name associated with it is Mario Tronti, who wrote a book called Workers and Capital, who for the new left in Italy became a sort of a Bible.
Yes.
Everybody read it. And it did have a major influence because it was a very sustained critique of the politics of communism, not only the Italian Communist Party, but communism, what it had meant, and a certain interpretation of historical materialism, a certain interpretation of Marxism. And I cannot go through it, but it had, it brought in new principles, a new way of reading Marx and reading the class struggle. Number one, which is now famous, is the idea that first comes the working class, and then comes capital. And what that meant, it meant that if you want to understand capitalist development, what is taking place with capitalism, how capitalism develops, you have to start from the struggle against it.
Yes.
In other words, capitalism is not a self-evolving system. It's not a system that is self-moving, but it's always a system that is responding. Because it is driven by exploitation, it is also driven by the necessity to break the forces that contrast that exploitation. And so you have to understand first working class struggle to understand what happens with capitalism. Secondly, another important principle, which was a break with the Leninist tradition too, was the idea that the wage struggle is a political struggle. The refusal of separation between wage, economic and political struggle. And it was the idea that, well, in a Keynesian project, where workers pay increases, wage increases, are always balanced by increases in productivity. The wage struggle acquires a political meaning. That struggling around wages can actually undermine capital's planning.
So is it fair to say that this was, I mean, your encounters with these and the principle of wage struggle is what drove the following? And I'm going to read a little bit because I think we're just trying to, let's say, go a little bit nostalgic today. So they say it is love. We say it is unwaged work. They call it frigidity. We call it absenteeism. Every miscarriage is a work accident. Homosexuality and heterosexuality are both workers' conditions. But homosexuality is workers' control of production, not the end of work. More smiles, more money. Nothing will be so powerful than destroying the healing virtues of a smile. Neurosis, suicides, desexualization, occupational diseases of the housewife. You wrote this in 1975 in Wages Against Housework. That was the entry part of the book. But before that, you already were involved in 1972 with the international, founding member of the International Feminist Collective that became known for the campaign for wages for housework. So would it be fair to say that your understandings of operaísmo from the direction of wages is what motivated like a wake up, or was there even more frustration towards Marxist orthodoxy, Marxist tradition of not understanding the sort of social reproduction or not including, or being part of it?
Well, I mean, when I look back, the formative elements in my, particularly in the 60s and 70s, late 60s and 70s, certainly operaísmo was one. Well, fundamentally, my whole experience as a woman in growing up in a post-fascist society, still fascist society, so those are fundamental. But also, operaísmo was important, as it was important, my experience here in the United States, with the Black Power movement, the movement against Vietnam, the student movement, all those were extremely, but in terms of operaísmo, I think first comes capital, then comes the working class, looking at the class struggle, looking at what people are doing, and seeing capitalism as responding to it. That has become part of my politics. That has become, something that, made immediately sense. Also, another theme important in operaísmo, particularly in Mario Tronti's work, which was the refusal of a certain communist view of the role of the working class, which was always seen as the workers, the historic task of the worker is to develop the productive forces. And Tronti was one of the first to say, this is making for a very reformist conception of class struggle, and he was very critical of the way the Communist Party in the post-war period had collaborated, with the capitalist development plans for all the repression, right? And his argument was class struggle is refusal of capitalism, is refusal of exploitation, is refusal of capitalist work. In fact, refusal of work became a big slogan. And so, more smile, more money, that's the refusal of work. And also the question of the wage. There was a lot of debate about the issue of wages and the political side of the wage. I think reading some of the operaísmo materials, and not only, I'm not speaking only for myself, but also other women with whom I worked, like Maria Rosa Dalla Costa, for instance. I think we were influenced by the debates on the wage that were taking place, and the wage as a political instrument, seen as the wage not as a packet of money, but seeing the wage as a form of organizing, as part of a power relation, part of a social, yes. And so the whole notion of, wages for housework, which was very misunderstood.
Yes.
Because the political side of it was never understood. It was always understood in a very reformist way, and never as a struggle of the appropriation. It was never seen as a struggle of the appropriation, which is what it was. And a refusal of bargaining our autonomy. Okay, we will bargain a little economic independence, becoming independent from men, but at the cost of doing more work. And the other element also that was important in operaismo that is only sketched, in Tronti, for instance, the notion of the social factory.
Yes, very important.
Which it's in Marx actually, because Marx argues that at a certain point of capitalist development, basically the logic of capitalism begins to shape all of society. So when you talk about the factory is way beyond the walls of any particular plant. So the idea of a social factory was the idea that what we call the community, the schools, etc., they're all restructured at a certain point of capitalist development. They are restructured in a way that functions for capitalism. What we added, and I think it was a breakthrough, is, but this begins in the home. Begins in the home, and it begins with women's unpaid labor, begins with the family, sexuality. All of these are relations of production. Family relations, sexual relations, these are relations of production. These are the core and the pillar of the social factory. So in that sense, yes.
So you were not finding, most of these texts, of course, did not include this, right? Tronti was not talking about social reproduction.
No, absolutely. No, it was a very masculine conception. There was no recognition at all of women, the reproduction of labor power, nothing. No, absolutely not.
And how was then at that time that you start, pushing all of these? What was the reception? What was the penetration, let's say, in the Marxist discourse or in the left discourse?
Oh, completely hostile, very hostile, very, very hostile, yes. So at least in Italy, but also in the United States, because I was in the United States. And I remember there would be time whenever we would have a public presentation, it was going into a battlefield. Yes. It was really going into battlefield. And of course also many feminists, who were struggling for the ERA, the equal rights, within a very, within a perspective that didn't really question the system. They didn't really question capitalism and the organization of work and property relations, etc. So it was not only the left that was hostile, but
Yeah, and after, you are working amazingly on this organization, with the national welfare rights movements, I think you have also some involvement, or there were influences.
Well, we was a big influence. Yes. The welfare movement was a big influence.
Yeah, the African American women claiming for subsidies, right?
Exactly, and the women in the national welfare rights movement, who increasingly became more and more dominant. They were the ones who were exerting more and more leadership in the movement. They were saying it openly. Yes. For instance, they were critical of the feminists when they spoke of the working woman. They said every mother is a working woman. Right? So do not separate the working woman as if she were only the person who works outside the home. Working in the home is work. We are producing the new generation of people. We are producing the new workers. So that to us was extremely important. And I still think it was a great tragedy that the feminist movement did not support, and they allowed the kind of denigration, vilification that women on welfare were subjected to, which was also very racist.
Yes,
very racist because, because, and by the way, the majority of recipients were white. The fact that black women were more visible because black women were coming from a tradition of struggle.
Yes.
They were those who were doing the struggle. They were doing the fighting. But actually the majority of the recipients were white women.
And that in a turn, I'm going to jump perhaps 10 years or somewhere around that, because something also crucial happens with your context with working with African women. That is your trip somewhere in the already in neoliberal times. We're talking about 84, something like that.
Yeah.
That you decide to go to Nigeria, Sub-Saharan Africa, and you stay
there. I
there.
did a lot of
right?
teaching there. I
Yes.
did a lot of teaching there, and I met a lot. I also worked with an organization called WIN, Women in Nigeria, which was one of the first feminist organizations. And yes, and that was another more turning point in my life.
So what was, I mean, like you come from a very strong contrast, a place full of memory and so on, to a place without a memory, completely suburban, and then jumping immediately to Sub-Saharan Africa condition, and the early 80s, which of course was very specific in Nigeria. They already with a very strong intellectual formation, theoretical formation. How do you how do you engage in that, after you come with that formation?
Well, again, on a number of levels, I think that was another changing moment in my life, big turning point on several levels. One was encountering a society that still had a strong communal tradition, despite the colonialism, despite all the years of colonialism, and of course the communal tradition had also changed, but nevertheless, I didn't know that in large parts of the world, for example, in large parts of the African continent, land was still not completely privatized. I thought all land more or less had been privatized. I knew that on the Alps there were some, areas where shepherds could go to make the cheese, but to have sheep and make. But I realized there that a lot of the land was still held communally. And this communalism affected all kinds of ways in which people behave with each other. It had affected the culture. That was an amazing discovery. Just talking with people, with my, people at school, etc., I would meet, they would say, you just live on wages? You don't have a place that if everything goes wrong, you can go back to? You don't have a village? You don't have any land? You don't have any land? You don't know. So I realized that a lot of people had been born into a communal land, access to land, communally managed. So that was a major discovery.
But also that communal land was not only managed, but was managed mostly by women, right?
And women, of course,
women were the
women
ones
important,
really, yes.
Because also and also the communal space, for instance, not only the land communally at the village, but also in the town. For instance, the space, the urban space, right? If you have traveled in Africa, you know that the market is a whole women event, it's a whole women affair, and people are taking over the streets. People selling in the streets. So the public space, here we talk about public space, but the public space is also very private. There are very serious limits to what you can do to it. Whereas there was a communalism that also affected the organization of urban space. Another example that I make often in this connection is the university. For example, at the university nearby where I was in Port Harcourt, in the spring, there'll be cows who will be pasturing on the fields of the university. Because the cow herds, the shepherds from the north, the cattle herd, would take the cows down and before they would be killed and the meat would be sold, they would fatten them up. Because the north is very dry, and it's almost like, it's very close to the Sahara. So they'll take the cows down, and the cows will circulate in the streets, in the town, in the urban space, and in the university, which I could never imagine, for example, in the United States. And nobody said anything, and on the campus where I was, there'll be women farming. women would be taking over, and I realized they had built the university on an expropriated village. But the women were coming back and retaking the land. Nobody said anything. I had colleagues who were growing crops. Colleagues who were growing crops on the land of the university, in the bush, where.
Yes.
So this began to make me realize. So if there was a strike, they would go back home, and they would bring back some food, and they would be able to gain some strength for the village. So I realized that the village actually still played a role in terms of class struggle in an urban setting.
Yes.
And that was a very big discovery.
Yes.
The second discovery was that I arrived at a time when the IMF and the World Bank were negotiating with the Nigerian government, as with many other
Most Africa
and Latin America, about the standby loans,
all the debt
because of the famous debt crisis,
Yes.
which we now know
Yes.
was totally engineered from with the rise of the interest rates on the dollars.
Paul Volcker.
Yeah, Paul Volcker,
Yes.
exactly.
Yes.
And so that whole debate, I think, was also very important. And the question of land, privatization.
And this puts us in a very, obviously everything you say is incredibly contemporary,
Absolutely,
But
absolutely.
in this case, I mean, we have seen continued discussions, especially, of course, people citing you on issues about commons and issues about land, communal land, and so on, and to understand that that influence on yourself happens or appears to be from that direction. Now, after you were in Africa, of course, you come back to the US.
Yes. And I was come back here all the time because
Yes.
I was there teaching periods, and then
And then how do you begin to transfer that knowledge, I mean, intellectually, but also as an activist? Because you start actually engaging even more and more until today, of course, you're currently engaged mostly in Latin America. But
yes.
I mean, I would say that period after you come back from Africa, a lot of things settled in terms of like your theoretical views about.
Yeah, because I've been fighting about wages for housework, which again is a whole issue that needs to be explained. But two things I think happened when I went to Nigeria and when I began to see the kind of global restructuring. Because what I saw in Nigeria was the beginning of globalization, structural adjustment, which was the response, the recovery program, the alleged recovery program for the debt crisis, was really one of the pillars of the globalization process. And what I began to realize, first of all, is the fragility of monetary values. Because one element in structural adjustment was massive devaluation. So imagine you have 1,000 naira, and within a space of a few years, those 1,000 naira are worth 10 nairas. When I went to it, was the naira was $1, 1 naira. Afterwards was 1,000.
Yes.
So massive devaluation. You have societies who are practically demonetized. Even if you have money, it means nothing, right? And only hard currency. So you have to. So you realize the fragility of monetary. So the idea, if women, we have to reappropriate and refuse unpaid labor, then we also need to complement, the monetary side of that equation. And the other side, it was the power of land, the question and the issue of territory, and the power of communal relation.
Yes.
And to be able to have an alternative to the money economy, how important it was. And when I began to travel in Latin America, after I came back, after I started working at Oxford, actually, because I started taking students to Mexico. That was my first contact with Mexico, beginning to take students, which I did at the time of NAFTA, because we knew that NAFTA was a disaster.
Yeah, that was
91
when the NAFTA appeared, so you were somewhere in the after.
Yeah, we started in 94, I think was the first time.
Yeah.
No, 92.
Mm-hmm.
The first time.
The NAFTA. Yeah.
We arrived with the first group of students on January 1st of 93. Well, no, 94. When was it the Zapatista? The day before, after the Zapatista took over. Yeah, 93, December 31, they take over San Cristobal. So we arrived in Mexico City on January 1st, 1994. And we arrived and everywhere, the big title, Zapatista, San Cristobal. Yeah, uprising. Yeah, it was an amazing lesson for all of us.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then over the years, I began to see that the same developments that have been taking place in Africa, also across Latin America. Actually, Chile was the first example of structural adjustment.
Absolutely.
It really begins in 1973.
Yeah.
You know, the neoliberal agenda coming with political repression and a massive imposition of a massive austerity program. That became the model that in one form or another was globalized because it was imposed on so many countries across the world.
Yes.
And but then over the years, going to more and more to Latin America, began to see the one response. You know, first of all, much of the response to austerity, to repression, you know, and really seeing the women in the forefront.
Yes.
You know, that in front of this massive crisis, putting in jeopardy the basic elements of reproduction, it was really the women who went out to the street to begin to pull together their resources, you know, form new networks, and in a way, begin a new system of reproduction. That began already in Chile with the comedores populares, popular kitchen, you know, where women were totally impoverished and terrorized because people were being disappeared and massacred, right? Then women begin, you know, having a bit more possibility of escaping the police. You know, they will go out with the children, holding the children, and you know, they will begin to shop together, cook together, bring the pots into the street, and that kind of restructuring of reproduction, collectivization of reproduction, has happened over and over and over, and has expanded. It has happened in Argentina in 2002, when the money economy collapsed, and the Piquetera movement. They brought back the reproduction in the street in Brazil, and you see today they are really large network. And I think one of the power of the women's movement in Brazil now is exactly that you have a movement that is basically struggling but transforming also the day-to-day social fabric of the community as they're struggling.
Yeah, this is one of the parts of your theory of your writings, which is always very striking, because you put a lot of emphasis on the conditions of housework as also, of course, applying for the need for some wages in the past, but also as the keeper of some kind of emancipatory sort of communal feeling that men have been completely dispossessed of for centuries, right?
Yeah.
So there is some reading about that communality that still remains with women, that perhaps one could argue that it's only through the mobilization of women that we're actually able to see something different. Yes.
Yeah, I think, for example, you know, that too often the women's movement has accepted the idea, very capitalist, that reproductive work is pure drudgery, period, and not seeing that it's drudgery in the conditions in which people have been forced to perform it.
Yes.
Isolation, you know, and totally, levels of poverty, pauperization in terms of space and possibilities of, but in under other conditions, there is no reason why reproductive work has to be less creative than any other activity. And I think that this is what is being recognized, by women who are now reorganizing their work in a very different level. And starting from agriculture, starting from having seed banks. Women are back to collecting the seeds, exchanging seeds with each other, not to have to eat Monsanto products,
Yes.
not to eat genetically modified food, right? So the whole issue of seeds, the question of agriculture, right? Thinking of different forms of agriculture, away from the monocultivo, away from, these horrendous. I was in Costa Rica recently, and I saw what they're doing they are having a kind of industrial growth of bananas and pineapples, never eat pineapple.
Yeah.
It was horrendous to see, miles and miles and miles of beautiful landscape destroyed to have these, products that are really raised with pesticides. In fact, the bananas grow in these blue plastic bags, which are full of pesticide. You don't see the bananas when you go through miles and miles of these. Yeah, but you see the plastic bags, which are full of pesticides, so the banana is not affected by any insect, and it comes out perfect. Possibly lethal from the chemicals that are, but looking very good. There's not one blemish.
And on the other side, Silvia, you have been for many decades working with a lot of women's groups around the world, right? As you mentioned, a lot in Latin America. And I think it's for us very important also to see precisely that levels of hope, right? That the things that you were telling, like women getting together and doing this and doing that. What are for you, incredible examples that you've recently seen of serious reorganization of social reproduction, etc.?
Yeah, I think in many different places. I think, for example, this network of women, campesinas, indigenous, urban, who work together, and they are very, very clear that you do not separate the struggle against capitalism from the struggle against patriarchy, from the struggle for a different environment, against the destruction of the environment. That this is like elements, and that each of these social problems affect the others.
Yes.
For example, when an oil company comes to town, the violence against women immediately increases. Right, and so that you cannot really separate.
It's all in a relational, very dialectical process.
Exactly, and so they see the need to fight, and there is a struggle also that is taking place in indigenous communities, who often are not egalitarian. So you have indigenous communities that might be able to keep the land in their hands, but might not allow women to participate in the assemblies, even though women do most of the work, etc., etc. So there is a big struggle that is taking place there. And it seems to me that in Latin America today, it's really women are driving the struggle. And I'm always warning, many people on the left who are very, they see that the struggle is over because, for example, now Lula, the PT, are out of power, and I'm saying no. This is a very limited conception of what the struggle is, because there is actually a very powerful women's movement. There is also a very powerful counter, reaction against, that we have seen, and which is growing.
Yeah.
But women are often on the front line in terms of in the rural area, struggling against deforestation, land privatization. They are very, very present in the urban struggle, and also they are occupying, lots of proletarian women, they are occupying the streets. They have moved the reproduction from the home to the street, with all kinds of contradiction, because the street, the square, it's also a dangerous place. But they have created new network, You know, that presence in the street is a very organized presence. It's a presence that is more and more organized.
And then you can see it so clearly. I mean, it really is.
So and I'm not alone. I think there is a literature now.
Yes.
There is quite a growing literature looking at what is happening and how this struggle is a struggle born out of necessity. So it's not a struggle that is a whim. No, it's a struggle that comes out from very deep needs, but it's also creating, you know, a new society. It's also creating new forms of new relation, new forms of reproduction, and not all might be able to continue in time, but there's a whole knowledge that is being produced also.
So with that,
and there is exactly, this is one also, the question of knowledge, the question of reappropriation of all the forms of knowledge, and as well the need to reconstruct the collective memory, the importance of the collective memory in strengthening the capacity for resistance. Right? That's an issue that I'm very, very interested in now. The role of memory. You know, when we talk about going to a place that has no memory, I'm very scared now. I'm really feeling devastated thinking about what the bombs of Saudi Arabia, the United States are doing throughout the Middle East and how they're leveling. And my theory is that they're leveling entire cities, not to defeat 2,000 or 3,000 people, but they're destroying anything that could be a source of emotional, political investment by the new generation in those lands.
It's a contemporary form of colonization.
Yeah. When you go back and the country, the place where you have your memories, it's pure rubble. There's nothing that is standing that can give you a sense of, a history in which you locate yourself. You have already suffered a major defeat. So I read a lot of the mistakes that have been made. This why, for example, you have the war to save a population, presumably, ends in the destruction of anything that could be of value to that population. So, so I think that to be able to move in an environment where what is around to you speaks to you, where there are memories that are connected, and of course each generation, right, decides anew what is the memory. Yeah. Each generation decides anew what is the memory. Because when we look at the past, there's not one view of the past, obviously. Every new generation looks at the past in a different way. But that necessity, to rethink where you come from, to rethink, and place yourself in a broader subjectivity, in a broader history, I think is very crucial.
In these sessions, we have been focusing a lot on the topic of the right to the city.
Yes.
As a broader sort of entry, right, of asking questions about many claim rights that we don't claim or we don't know what they are. And I would like to perhaps conclude this, what it has been such an amazing conversation, so we give way to the graduate students to ask some questions to you. Sure. I would like to conclude with that question. I mean, in your mind, considering this really beautiful trajectory that we went through of your development, today, at this moment, what is the right to the city and what do we claim it? How do we claim it? Sorry. Yes.
Well, you see, I think David Harvey says that the right to the city is the right to transform the city. It's not just the right to inhabit the city, but it's the right to transform it. And I agree with that. And I think that this is what women are doing now. Not only women, but I think that that's what women are. Yeah. Yes, they are transforming the city. Yeah. They are transforming the urban space. I say that now the face of the city is the face of a woman, in the sense that you see that women have really migrated into the public space. And I think that it's very important to look at the struggle for the city, not only in terms of health, which is crucial. That's step number one, the right to be able to have a home and not to be displaced. But on the other hand, also I think the struggle for creating what in Latin America is called like a territory, right? Not just the home, but the community, and a space where people have contiguity, where people can actually establish tight relations, where you can have forms of collective action. This, I think, is extremely important to the project of transformation.
Thank you very much, Silvia.
Thanks to you.
This was another episode of Cities After. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to subscribe.